Hello everyone, welcome back. So today we are going to discuss with data policies, and with the data policies we are going to fulfill one of the requirement with our needed application. So to begin with, what is actually the data policies are? The data policies enforce data consistency by making a fields a mandatory or read-only in a form or in a particular record. But for the same purpose, if you think back, we already have UI policies. Then what is the differences between these UI policies and data policies? To understand a bit more further, let's go with the UI policies. As we know, UI policies will only invoke if there is any changes on a website on the form level. That means that in our ServiceNow, we can create records in a table through various mediums. Through the web forms, we can create records, and using the data imports and transform maps, we can insert the data into a table, or using the business rules and the scripts and glide record API queries, we can insert records into a table. And finally, we can also use SOAP and REST messages to insert the records into a table. But since UI policies are very limited onto the form, when you are loading the data using the other channels that we have, these UI policies will not come into picture, and it won't make certain fields are mandatory or read only or hidden. Those kind of a changes will not be possible with the UI policies when you're loading this data from when you're inserting records from external recording through various other channels. Whereas data policies are configured or executed at the database level, you can think about these data policies in one way of before business rules. So it gets executed when the form gets saved, updated into the database. So if you're using the web form, eventually data gets stored in the database record, and data imports also same, that gets hits on the database table, business rule and scripts and SOAP and REST messages. So if you want to have the consistency of making certain fields mandatory based on certain conditions, then it is best recommended approach by using the data policies. But if you are limiting something over to the web, then we can also use the UI policies. And later in today's discussion, we can see the comparison between the UI policies as well as data policies as well. Then what is the configurations of the data policies? So this is how the form looks like for the data policy, and it expects you to select a table on which this data policy is going to be enforced. Then inherit. This is a check mark. If you select the check mark, if there is any other table which extends this table, then this data policy is also been applies on the inherited table as well. Then reverse if false. This reverse if false, when it checked, whatever the rules that we have on the data policy, if the condition is not met, it executes totally to opposite way. The next one we have is apply import sets. Apply import sets. When you're loading the data or when you're creating the records in a ServiceNow table by using the data imports or import sets, if you want this data policy to be coming to picture, then we have to select this. And through the web services, we want to enforce some data consistency using the data policy. We can also select this. The next option, use as UI policy on client. This is quite interesting option. We will get this checked with an example. Till then, for the definition purpose, if you want to see that field as a mandatory or as a read only, even when a verb, if the conditions are met, then we have to check mark this, and that behavior can also be reflected at the web. If you don't select this enforcement will be happening on this form is submitted or updated. But if you want to see that prior to that, then this check mark needs to be selected. Then creating a data policy rules. As we discussed, data policies only can do two things. One is it can make a field mandatory based on the condition if you have any condition, or it can make a field read only. These two attributes can be set on a particular field. But as in UI policy, you can also do one more additional operation to make the field as hidden or visible. But what happens when the data policy conditions met false? There could be two situations. One is no action being taken, and the second one is the opposite action being taken. How does ServiceNow knows which action has to be taken? So if the reverse if false check mark is selected, that means that if a condition returns false, that exact opposite behavior of the rule will be took place. For example, if your condition is satisfied and you're making a field as a mandatory, but for certain reason the condition returns false, then the field will not be a mandatory anymore. That is exactly behaves the opposite way the rule is being configured. If there is no if the check mark is not selected, then there is no action being taken place. Using the data policy as UI policy. So, for example, you want to make a field as a mandatory and you have selected the option here to use UI policy as a client. If the condition is met, if a field is a mandatory and the UI, you get to see that asterisk symbol at the label of the field, that behavior that you can expect by using the data policy as when you have the check mark as use data policy as UI policy. Then next one, what is the differences between the data policies and UI policies? Both data policies and UI policies enforce data consistency by setting up field attributes based on the condition. As we know, data policies execute at the server-side script, whereas UI policies executes at the client side. But as a developers, how do we determine which one to use, either the data policy or the UI policy? Below is the table format where we can understand better and we can make a decision in future based on the requirement. For example, if the field value attributes needs to be set based on the value change of the field, this can be done both with the data policies and UI policies as well. And if you want the enforcement to be happen on submitting a form or updating a record or submitting a record, then data policy only available. UI policy will execute that at the web on the UI side of it. Execute on form fields values changes. Execute on form field value changes. This both data policies and UI policies both can be executed when the field value changes. Can we make a mandatory fields? Can we make a field mandatory? This can be done both with the data policies and UI policy sets. Both can be done. Can I make a field visible or not visible? This will not be possible with the data policy, and this can be possible with the UI policy. Set field attributes with no scripting. This is also one of the important thing. Whereas in UI policy, you have an option to use the scripting. There is a two script fields. Return if true, what is the script? Return if false, what is the script? But here in the data policies, you don't have an option. If there is any complex condition that you want to write, or if you want to enforce something based on certain conditions, then UI policy is better. Execute scripts for advanced logic. So this is also data policy cannot be done with the executing with advanced script logic. But as I said, UI policy can be done. Can we set field attributes with no scripting? This can be done with both UI policies as well as data policies. With that, there is an option for us where we convert an UI policy to the data policy as well as a data policy to the UI policy. But what could be the situations as we discussed? previously, we can also discuss here these rules. You have a data policy, but the policy logic needs to dynamically control the field visibility. What is important thing is visibility. Visibility cannot be done with the data policy. It can only be done with the UI policy. You have a data policy, but the policy logic needs a bit of a scripting. So we don't do that. It's not possible with the data policy. Then we have to go with the UI policy. But you have a UI policy where the policy logic needs to be applied when the data is getting imported using the data sources and import sets. So UI policies will not be an option here. We have to go to the data policy. And when you want to apply this logic, when the business rule gets inserting a data or getting executed, or a flow or server-side application logic, then you can't do with the UI policy. It can be done with the data policies as well. So with that, we will discuss next with an use case in our needed application. Additional comments are mandatory when the state of the needed application or the task state is withdrawn. Let's go to the task here. So what they are saying here is, when there is state is withdrawn, when the state is withdrawn, then we have to have work notes. This additional comments or work notes needs to be a mandatory. Let's go to our needed application. Let's go to the needed application. Let's see if you have anything already been placed. Make it as inactive. And create a new data policy for this. Why we are creating the data policy? Because we want this behavior to be applied, or we want to have this behavior of work notes as mandatory in all cases, not only web, but even when we are loading the data using the import sets, or when we are loading the data using script includes or business rule, or when we are creating data using the SOAP integrations or REST integrations. We would like to have this work notes to be mandatory. For that, let's go here, create a data policy. So type data policy, create, and the table that we want to run this data policy is on needed table. And I don't want this to be executed as of now as UI policy, use as UI policy on client. I'm not going to check this. Give a meaningful name to this. The meaningful name that we would like to place it here is needed state set to withdrawn, or else additional comments are required when state is withdrawn. And let's submit this. What is the condition we have? When the state of the request is withdrawn, we would like this data policy should be invoked. So let's create a data policy rule. What can data policy can do? It can do two things. It can make a field mandatory, or it can make a field read only. What is the field that we want? Additional comments, and mandatory is true. I'm not bothered about read only because we are not interested to play with that. So let's keep this as a leave alone. So this rule will not consider anything for this on this particular field for the read only behavior. Let's submit this. And let's refresh it. We will have this field is a mandatory, but you also have the reverse if false. If state is not withdrawn, then the exact opposite will be happening for this. What is the exact opposite for the rule? That comments will not be a mandatory one. So let's go here, refresh this form. Keep an eye on here, work notes. I'm going to select withdrawn. Is there any indication that these work notes are mandatory? If I set the state to withdrawn, no. As of now, no, but let's select few options. Let's select submit the form, testing data policy, and submit this. So as soon as you're trying to hit this data, or you're trying to take this data and place it on a database, this needed table, then this data policy coming to picture and sees that, okay, the state is withdrawn and work nodes are empty. So you're not allowed to insert or update this record. That's fine. But I would like to make an indication to the user as soon as he selected withdrawn. I would like to see an indication here as a mandatory how UI policy creates that behavior. We want to have that same behavior, but this time with the data policy. So to have that, we need to select this option, use data UI policy of the client, and update this. And let's refresh this form. Let me go ahead and add the additional comments field to the form. So from here, go to the form layout and bring this additional comments section here to this and click on save. So once we have the field, and if I go change here to withdrawn, we could see that as a UI policy in the web, this field will give an indication for that as this additional comments are mandatory. So thank you so much. We'll see you in the next session.